These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Normally, we provide an introduction to our programs that attempt to situate and properly orient our conversations. However, there are those instances where conversations have their own way of orienting themselves, creating paths to push us to seek more information or expand and further strengthen paths that we've already started. What we will present today is one of those conversations that take on a life of its own and highlight paths to push us to think beyond the limits of now. They form organically in this conversation. Today, we are pleased to have filmmaker Ọnuọra Abụah of AEA Films back with us to talk about the recent work that they have been involved in. We situate the efforts in a tradition of memory keepers as they are using new material technologies. The documentaries we reference in this conversation can be viewed on AEA Films' webpage. As a director, writer, producer, Ọnuọra Abụah began his career as an actor in London. Born in Kenya to a Nigerian father and Rwandese Ugandan mother, he spent most of his youth living across Central and West Africa. After starring in his self-written play, Another Biafra, and plays in theater, he soon began writing his debut feature film, Woolwich Boys, receiving acclaim and television distribution in the UK and Africa. His sophomore feature, Mona, was invited to over 20 film festivals around the world, winning the Luxor African Film Festival's grand prize and nominated for numerous other awards. A full catalog of the collective work of AEA Films can be found at www.aeafilms.com. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen closely, think intently, act accordingly. Enjoy the program.
You know
Yeah.
But go ahead.
It's funny you say so just you were talking about Obi Egbuna, and senior rather. And Obi Egbuna is actually from the same state as in Nigeria, Anambra State, which is the Chinua Achebe is from there, Nnamdi Azikiwe is from there. Anyway, reason why I just remembered something that my father is around the same age, contemporary of his. And I just remember I was working last year. I had the opportunity to look at a project about scholars that came from Anambra State, and not just scholars but political figures and so on. And I remember Obi Egbuna was part of is it WASU? If you remember WASU,
West African Student Union.
Yeah, and one of the key things for me was when I think they brought Malcolm X over at some point in '65, just before he was killed, not long before that whole Oxford period when he was banned from France and so on. So anyway, it's so funny when you just brought him up. I just remember just a few days, just a few months ago, trying to do some research on him. So it's just serendipity and the ancestors, as you said, my brother, is
No, and also as a testament to the work and the transnational currents that go on through the work that we all are doing. We're thinking we're doing it in a certain space, but we're also having a clear ancestral and historical, conscious and unconscious connection to what's happening, to work that's going on across the world that we all are doing. And the conditions within which that obviously that we're in, right? I'm here in the heart of Babylon, and right in DC itself, right? It's great, and of course, right, and of course we're at the colonizer's colonizer school. You're in London. So.
I'm in the colonizers teach us.
Right.
So that's where I am right now. Where they learned it.
But how we deal with those conditions ancestrally. Yeah. We deal with those conditions through the memory, and how we actually are trying to capture that and to have those conversations, in a transnational context is super important. So as of course, us having a contact and building a relationship over years with just a quick little reach out and I'll respond, and it's been going since then, and I'm like,
it's been a few years for sure.
Yeah. So it's funny, but when you're talking about the research and you're talking about these narratives and stories, this leads us to actually having it while we're here today, right? This leads us to actually, that's why I said, let me just go ahead and press record, because I'm sure we're going to say something that's going to, move into, and with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. What's been up? What's been going on? Because you do a lot, but what's been going on, man? And let me also kind of contextualize, because the last time we talked about, the project that you was doing on voodoo, right? Connecting that more to its, its ancient roots, looking at ancient Egypt or Kemet, looking at and tracing that in the West African context. And of course, that was a very, very important film. So let's pick up there and then move into, so what has happened since then?
Okay, a lot has happened, my brother. So first of all, let me start by saying I appreciate you having me on. It's always a pleasure, to be in a, just as you said, sometimes you feel as though you work in isolation, and your work is maybe for a select few somewhere. But I think what I'm starting to realize is in all our respective fields, it's part of the greater work that needs to be done. And I'm very grateful to always be having a conversation with you. So let me just first of all say that. Now, since Dahomey and Vodun, which is the two-part series we did on the Dahomey Kingdom and the Vodun spiritual system, we went on and shot a documentary in Mali. I think I mentioned it towards the tail end of the last episode that we did. So the documentary essentially focuses on 1,000 years. It's called 1,000 Years to Tombouctou. So it's about my journey from Bamako to Tombouctou by road, which, of course, as you know, at the moment is littered with jihadi groups, and not just jihadi groups, but, whether you call it austerity or the influence of the French involvement, and then poverty has led to groups who have lived in these regions for centuries in peace have now created conflict. So essentially, it's my journey from Bamako to ancient city of Djenné to Tombouctou, and also documenting the history of the empire of what they call Ghana or Ouagadougou, Mali or Niani, and Songhai. So basically, we focus on 1,000 years of history. So two-part series. So that's what we did immediately after that one. We've since gone on after that. We shot a very mini documentary on the Emirates of Kano. Kano being a major city in northern Nigeria, which was one of the group of Hausa states. If you know anything about the Hausa states, we talk about Amina of Zazzau or Zaria being one of them. Katsina, Daura, these 7 great cities which never united but came together as part of what is now called Northern Nigeria. But we're, individually we're known for their, different raw materials that they produced, as well as cultural influence of Islam and how that came into that part of the world. And it's interesting because I actually want to go back and do more on that part of the world, because it's very interesting. One thing that's very interesting, I think, particularly when we look at West Africa, is understanding the influence of Islam. And I'm not a Muslim myself, but certainly the way African people in that part of the world accepted Islam or chose Islam for their own and adapted it in a way that suited them is very different to the way it happens, say, in Northern Africa, Eastern Africa to an extent. And so it's very interesting to see how that comes to play as a young, remembering my own history, growing up in Nigeria, growing up in Togo, growing up in Benin, and seeing how Islam was practiced. It's very different to when I go to a place like Dubai, for instance, or wherever. But anyway, I digress. So we made a documentary on Kano. And then after that, we went and made a two-part documentary on the founder of Sahara Reporters, which they call the WikiLeaks of Africa, Omoyele Sowore. Used to be based out of New York with Sahara TV. We made a documentary on him. Obviously, for those who know anyway, he ran for president in 2019 unsuccessfully because, unfortunately, the electoral system in Nigeria is designed for numerous other reasons beyond choosing the right leader. Anyway, so he was eventually jailed. And then upon his release from prison, I reached out, chased him down, and went and spent 5 days with him, trying to sort of follow, trying to understand the man that became Omoyele Sowore. Because he's a rarity, in the sense that you may not necessarily agree with everything that he says or does, but there's one thing which we complain about constantly in Africa, and we have done since the days of since the decline of the Sankaras and so on of this world, is we have no leaders. We have no leaders. There's nobody that's willing to die for this country. But here we have a figure who really is, has shown all the evidence of someone who thinks, look, my life is just as valuable as the average Nigerian, which is a very interesting perspective to even publicize, whether you believe it or not. So we made a documentary about him. And also we've made a series of short films last year. I moved to Nigeria last year, actually. I was in Nigeria for the first half of the year. And we made a short film about exploring trans-Saharan migration. These economic migrants who try and go through Niger and then Libya and then try and make it to Europe. So we explored that in a short film called Tafia, which is in the Hausa language translates to, I suppose, journey or traveling. And then we made another film called, a short film called Oji, which in the Igbo language means the kola nuts, the symbol of welcoming and I suppose fraternity, welcoming in the Igbo culture. And then, of course, we've been, maybe I haven't mentioned this to you, I don't think, but I think I mentioned it to you in probably the first interview that we did, is we've finally been commissioned to do a documentary on Kemet, which we fly out next month to go and shoot. So we spent the last 2 years, I've been going back and forth to Cairo to just to plan and do additional research. And that basically is based off a paper by Dr. Obadile Kambon of the Institute of African Studies in Ghana, University of Ghana, Legon. So it's based off a paper that he wrote called Why Kemet Matters. And what the documentary essentially is going to be about is not necessarily focusing on the DNA of Egyptians or whatever. It's gone beyond that, now discussing why is it even important for them to use the name Kemet at a time like this. And so the documentary is really about, because he reads Medu Neter or hieroglyphics, and so it's really in search of texts and what they say about themselves. It's a very unique take on documentaries, I suppose, when it comes to ancient Egypt. So that's what I've been up to, my brother.
No, and yes, and as always, a lot. But there's a strand here, and I actually want to move back, and let me just say this: the reason why I wanted to kind of have the conversation start off in an organic manner is because what I wanted to do is to really highlight the genealogy and the tradition that you are clearly standing in, the tradition of the memory keepers. That come out of the West Africa. And of course, we have these, the different, conceptualizations or categorizations of community and people's memory keepers. In West Africa, we have the jellies and the domas. This is the tradition. What I wanted to do, the reason why I wanted to do this and start out this way is because what you just demonstrated is you are literally, this 21st century doma, a jelly, that is mapping, and making sure that we collect and store and archive the memories of our people, the memories of an assortment of communities. And so that's the reason why, as I said, the ancestors are always working. There's always this instance of how we approach conversations. And I didn't want to approach this conversation in a technical manner. Number one is because we know each other. Number one is that I wanted us to have a conversation, not just me peppering you with questions. So I wanted to preference this to go back to a point that you said, this notion that, we have no leaders, but yet you're documenting, one particular leader. And this, I think, and this is, I can get your response because you can kind of, situate or couch your response to this, to what I'm about to say, in the work that you're doing and trying to create narratives that counter these particular narratives, whether it's a historical, whether it's a socio-political, whether it's movement. And so I would argue, and what you've shown with this documentary is the false narrative that we have no leaders, because there's an intentionality in historical amnesia that is placed on the communities that leaders are literally sitting beside folk on, and like, so, and the reason why I'm saying this, I'm thinking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I'm thinking about Mushiri, it comes out of East Africa, who writes about, this intentionality and historical amnesia. And this relates directly to here, to United States, that you have an intentionality. Memory isn't lost, it's intentionally suppressed. But this is, so I would love to hear, like, when you said that, because, obviously you are debunking that. You are literally trying to deconstruct this narrative, and it is across the continent, and of course, it's a very mixed bag here in the United States or in the diaspora. True. But your response to that, like, were you intentionally trying to disrupt that narrative?
I think the decision to focus on him really just came out of a desire from, so again, people who know about this man and who know his history know that he wasn't the only one who sort of rose up through the ranks, but the way he did it was different. So you have figures, even in politics today, and we're speaking specifically about Nigeria. So let me just, for the sake of confusion, stick to that. You have figures now who started, whether it be, so they had there was a Sankara movement in the 1980s. It's a student-led university movements across Nigeria throughout the 1980s. Sowore was a part of that. And these are people who would chant Aluta Continua in a so-called Anglophone country and would really be inspired by the works of Cabral and so on. And this is at a time when Nigeria and most of West Africa really is undergoing severe dictatorship and then military dictatorship, which came towards the mid 80s and then the 90s. So trying to get rid of military dictatorships, and Sowore, as well as many others, is part of this. The difference with him is at a time when he could have taken the money, for example, Chief MKO Abiola, and we focus on this in the beginning of the second part of the documentary. Chief MKO Abiola, there's this very famous, for those who don't know, Chief MKO Abiola won, there was an election in the early 1990s. It was an election put together by the then military head of state. I have to be careful with this dictator. You overuse it sometimes, and it just sounds like you're perpetuating the same stereotype that is put by Europeans. But anyway, General Babangida was the president at the time, put together this sort of election based around the US system. This is when the federation really starts to mimic the US in terms of outlook. So he puts these two political parties. Chief MQ Abiola wins in one, but the election is annulled. There's a very famous bit of footage shot by one of the local TV stations where him and all the sort of student activists stood behind him. And Omoyele Sowore, at the age of about 21, is behind him. Now, it's very easy to look at that image and say, okay, no doubt he went into politics, became a senator, became a billionaire, and so on. But he's one of the few who chose not to. He instead came to America, worked odd jobs, started this so-called WikiLeaks sort of thing, Sahara Reporters, really did grassroots work to expose corruption, down to the point where when the president had died President Yaradua, who had died, became president in 2007. He had died in Saudi Arabia, and no political official was saying that this person is dead. Instead, he goes and through his, I think the tagline for Sahara Reporters is "Report yourself." So you have individuals citizens essentially sending footage, sending evidence, and exposing it, a bit like WikiLeaks. So he's the only one, his outfit, Sahara Reporters, is the only one who's exposing that this man's dead. The rightful person should be his vice president. Anyway, and many others, which I'm sure anybody who's interested can go and find out. So he's chosen to go at it from this grassroots level. In other words, the people are more important. And so my decision even to focus on him came just purely from the fact that I'm seeing something in him that is very different to what I see, at least on this level. And so when he decided to go into politics in 2018, decided to run in the election of 2019, it was very hard to not support him, because this is a man who also did what many of the political aspirants in Nigeria don't do, which is to travel the country and speak to the people. So I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but I think maybe it was indirect, but I absolutely was trying to show that we have leaders. We have leaders, but they don't necessarily have to rise through the ranks of and this is one of the criticisms, that he hasn't risen through the ranks. He hasn't been a local councillor, a local government chairman, senator, and so on. They say, why don't you run? That was what they kept saying, is why don't you run for that instead of running for president? He's like, I have the right to run for president. And it's in a way, there's this in addition to the amnesia that we have, there's also this this desire to emulate America. Nigeria, I mean, a couple of things, just, the way we run our politics, we assume that this nation with 300 different ethnic groups, different languages, culturally more different than a European and say a South American, more different in terms of culture. In many ways, we're talking about a few miles away from each other. We have these people just putting all of that aside to try and emulate what America does. And so what ends up happening is we say, oh no, this person is from this political party, and we end up talking politics without necessarily dealing with issues, And I think one thing which, in the defense of the United States of America, is they have a much more developed system that works for them. Whereas in Africa, we're still trying to find a system that works for us, where the concept of democracy, and then there's democracy in reality, And I think whilst this gentleman that I'm focusing on focuses on democracy in reality, he himself is also a victim of the Americanization of African politics. So yes, he is a leader, absolutely. And I think we have to be realistic that leadership is not going to come as we all thought growing up, that there will be a revolution and that will be a bit like the Arab Spring or what happened recently in Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, this kind of military takeover or, people-led takeover. Maybe it won't happen necessarily in Nigeria, but we are seeing individuals emerging, and he's one of the leaders, certainly.
And so for that to actually take place, there has to be conditions, particularly for young folk who are, becoming radicalized, who are studying history, who are attempting on some, individual and collective level to disrupt what they think about what a Nigeria should be in the first place, right? Because I know, in watching the documentary, there were, of course, you not only focus on him, but you also talk to the people that are around him. Exactly. Talk a little bit about that. Talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the first episode is actually called Friends and Comrades. And the first half of it, we look at Omoyele Sowore, and the other half is really focusing on the people around him. Now, many of those individuals, if you go and look into their backgrounds, have been student activists, have been activists in so many different areas, but they came together and are almost working using the platform of Omoyele Sowore to continue the, lack of a better word, struggle. In fact, one of them, a young guy, 21-year-old Michael, forget his surname, but he's in the documentary. The EndSARS riots, for those of you who don't know, was a series of riots that took place, rebellions essentially, against police brutality at the end of 2020 in Nigeria. And it really felt at that point that Nigeria is, on this sitting on this powder keg. At any moment, once it's lit, it's going to explode. But somehow, it really was unprecedented. You haven't seen this since, maybe minor bits of evidence going back to maybe pre-independence to an extent. But anyway, you hadn't seen anything like this, and it seemed as though we were close. This Michael guy, who's was one of the people in the documentaries, and one of the people that's around Sowore, and by the way, the documentary was shot before the EndSARS riots. He's one of the people who went and protested the reopening of the toll gate. If you remember, the toll gate was the famous place where the innocent people were shot by the army. And about 6 months after the EndSARS riots, he was one of they were thinking about reopening the toll gate. And he's one of the people who went and protested. There's also a saxophonist who we document. He's partially blind. Again, in the documentary, he's just one of the people that's there. But this is one of a few people who only in the last 3 or 4 months was arrested for protesting against upcoming elections. Very publicized protests, and numerous other people. So in a way, the documentary uses Omoyele Sowore as the platform in order to build off the emerging leaders even behind him. Omoyele Sowore is 51 or 52, so he's not an old man, but he's certainly not, I guess a young, fresh leader. There are people behind him, and he's maybe setting an example for them. And it's interesting because I saw him just a few months ago, and when I went there, there was a whole new crop of young people around him. So I think what this does for the average Nigerian, the average, and I say specifically West African, is it shows that the leadership that we all expected that will change the way our countries are doesn't necessarily have to come through the political arena in that sense. It could eventually lead there, but it may come through, it's all around you. It's about finding the people all around you and supporting them. And I think that is what Sowore represents for a lot of people.
No, and that's very important. And so,
look what you desire,
Look at the condition.
We are currently listening to a conversation I recently had with Ọnuọra Abụah of AEA Films. As a director, writer, producer, Ọnuọra Abụah began his career as an actor in London. Born in Kenya to a Nigerian father and Rwandese Ugandan mother, he spent most of his youth living across Central and West Africa. After starring in his self-written play, Another Biafra, and plays in theater, he soon began writing his debut feature film, Woolwich Boys, receiving acclaim and television distribution in the UK and Africa. His sophomore feature, Mona, was invited to over 20 film festivals around the world, winning the Luxor African Film Festival's grand prize and nominated for numerous other awards. A full catalog of the collective work of AEA Films can be found at www.aeafilms.com. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen closely, think intently, act accordingly. Enjoy the program.
And it should need what you want. I hope you got what you need.
For a lot of people.
No, and that's very important. And so, maybe I don't remember this being in a documentary, but a question just occurred to me in the context, because again, I'm using the subject of the documentary as being a platform for a wider lens is important, which brought me to the question. I don't remember if this was in the documentary in one of the two parts, but did you get a sense of the young folk and the people who are part of basically a coalescence of a movement? Because, there are people engaged in different activities who are circling around, one particular individual. Was there a sense, or did you get a sense that there is a connection to a more Pan-African continental struggle? Because of course, Burkina Faso, there are things going on, around in South Africa and other places, in West Africa, other places. Did you get a sense that there was an awareness of that? And was any of that informing any of the movements or any of the work that was being done?
Okay. I mean, two things. For one, in the documentary, I make that link. In fact, the summary I make at the end of the second documentary is I can't even remember what I said, but in the voiceover, I discuss how I use the analogy of Rome falling. The British Empire, how in 1945, if you told them by 1960, these places that you have will be whittled down to a few, you wouldn't believe it. And then I discuss how Mali, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea, and Burkina Faso, all in the last 2 years have fallen. It's very possible that Nigeria could easily follow suit. From the actual individuals, from Showore to start with, is when he was picking his political party to join, there was an idea of a collective. Forget the terminology. A coalition of smaller political parties, because I don't know, Nigeria has something like 200 political parties, and they were talking about bringing the, I suppose, younger minds together. It didn't work out, and so he chose deliberately to create a political party called the African National Congress. It was a very important thing, because you have to go back to the 1950s to look across West Africa, whether it be Ghana, Nigeria, various other places where as leaders are creating political parties, they use the word Africa. See, which is a very significant thing. So Showore has done that by creating the African National Congress. Now, the solidarity that a lot of these guys feel, fortunately and unfortunately, is very based off the kind of socialist thing that we saw. Cuba is a huge influence for student activists in Nigeria, and has been for decades. The kind of what are the ones? The idea that these people, and the circumstances are very different. When you look at Cuba and you look at Nigeria, circumstances are different. But this is something that they choose to try and emulate. And I remember COVID was happening at the time, and they were really looking at how Cuba was dealing with the COVID pandemic and seeing how, okay, if we were running the country, we would do it similar to them. So in a way, I must say this, there is still a lack of, be careful with my words, but there's still a lack of I don't want to use the word immaturity, but I think I've just used it. We still think in a textbook way when it comes to certain issues relating to politics or history. And we don't look around us to see examples that are more akin or more suitable to us as African people. So there's still this Cuba, this socialist thing, you know, there's this Leninist, Marxist-Leninist point ideology that's still pervasive. And Sowore, being a man who's more, I guess, traveled than a lot of these guys, and travel is, we kind of underestimate how important travel is. I think, you know, even when we talk about African people, you know, we have this colonialist direction. If you're from Burkina or from Benin or from Togo, the only place you ever think about going to is France. Now the United Arab Emirates has come up. If you're Nigerian, England, America, you know, there's this kind of mentality that's still pervasive, but we don't even cross the border necessarily into Benin. We don't cross the border into Cameroon. We don't cross far into Togo, into Ghana, and so on. You know, so there's still this lack of understanding as to how things work on this continent, which eludes them. But I mean, which they're not quite grappling. So I think when it comes to their own sense of what is going on in Burkina, they may be aware, but I didn't necessarily get the impression from them that that is an example to follow, or that is even a case study to analyze. And which is why at the end of the second documentary, I kind of made those links and references so that you can see that even though they don't see it, if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see that these things are happening, you know, and there's these connections are being made. And sometimes I think throughout the history of African people across the last 600 or 700 years, when it comes to movements that are ultimately leading to the end of a major system which has oppressed us, whether it be enslavement or whatever, or colonialism, it happened with people not necessarily, you know, maybe at a more middle class or level, they were making the connections outside. But the people on the grassroots who were unaware of what's going on were always doing these things in a similar way to saying the ancestors are working and they are linking, and you may not see it, but ultimately the creator sees it and is bringing it together. And that seems to be what is happening. It seems to be what is happening. It's ironic, and sorry, I know I'm prolonging this answer, but it's ironic that J.J. Rawlings is seen as is called into Mali to discuss the transition after the coup. It's interesting. You know, this is something interesting to think about. J.J. Rawlings in 1979 was this rogue flight lieutenant. And even in Ghana, he's seen in two different ways. He's seen as the revolutionary, but he's also seen as the dictator. So it's just these things are interesting. So history will look at it one way, but the influence of the people on the ground will look at it a different way. And ultimately they will come together and create some uniformity in what is happening on the continent.
No, that's the reason why I wanted to ask that question, because again, I saw that at the end, right? I saw you make the link, but what was interesting, and I was going back and thinking, was there a particular consciousness or a connectedness that the people, again, because you were there, and there was things that, of course, you can capture or keep on film, but there's also things that how you're able to, but you're still aware of them. And I think that your point is very, very important because, again, when we're thinking about leaders, or we're thinking about, socio-political context, our history, it tends to, we tend to look at it, or we are conditioned intentionally to think outside of the places within which we are at, to the indigeneity of who we are as a people. And also at the same time, understand how that connects through the processes that snatched Africans and put them across the world, right? That's the reason why I wanted to situate my question in this notion of a Pan-Africanism, right? Because there's all of these, I'm sure you heard about the I don't even know what you call it, the crazy conversations about diaspora and all these other particular things happening here in the United States with, other entities who see it very, very differently. And not to get onto that, because what is important for us is to focus on what is happening and the people that it's happening to, and that is actually making it happen. And I think that is important. So this process, which I don't want to leave, this particular conversation, but there was something that was very important, because you also talked about travel, right? Which leads into your other document. So what I'm doing here is really showing and pulling out these strands, these threads, and also showing how there's an intentionality, but also there's just a pure genealogy that's happening here as well, that you're following these themes, which moves into, I'll give you an opportunity to, if you wanted to say anything else about, the documentary of the movements that are happening and bubbling, the Sahara reports in Nigeria, before we transition, because I really want to take the opportunity as that segue to kind of weave these pieces together, because I think it's fascinating. You produce this work, right? You produce this work. You don't necessarily know how people are going to, map it together, piece it together, or, sometimes you have, your particular, obviously intentionality, but unintentionally moving into all of these other particular spaces, So I want to give you an opportunity to say, if you wanted to say something else before we link these films that you've done over the past 2 years?
Yeah,
about 2
just a few years. Yeah. Well, with the Mali ones, 4 years ago we shot them.
Okay.
Now let me say this though, because it's almost it's refreshing to hear how someone else looks at the work, the collective work. Again, we said this at the very start. It feels like we're all in our different bubbles doing various works in different fields, and don't really know how it all links in the grander scheme. But then even in our own individual journeys, I am someone who was a product of travel. It's very unusual to have a Rwandese mother and an Igbo father from Nigeria. I don't believe there's anybody else with that, with who has that bloodline. I've never met anyone with that thing. Please excuse me, my daughter's screaming in the background. Just bear with me. Shut the door.
No, it's absolutely fine.
But I'm a product of travel. My mother is a Rwandese refugee who in 1958-59, when the first massacre was happening between Hutus and Tutsis after the Belgians were getting ready to leave, left as a refugee to Uganda and grew up as a refugee in Uganda and went to school in Kenya. And then my father is growing up in colonial West Africa at a time when Chinua Achebe is being born and being influenced by his culture, and seeing one generation go from being completely Igbo in their sensibility and spirituality to becoming Catholic, to the point where an Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart would rather commit suicide than convert to Christianity. These are the challenges that my father is seeing. So, and then he travels to Lagos, which at this point in time is a separate region entirely from what is then called Southeastern Nigeria or Igbo land, according to the British. And 1960 sees independence, and then goes to England, and then goes to Luxembourg and studies, and then returns and works in the Nigerian Foreign Service and travels and travels and travels. It's you know, the way I look at my own work is, in a sense, a search for what it is that makes me, in a sense, you know, what is it that made me possible. And so when it comes to travel, for me, especially growing up as an African, we're not taught history in primary school. We're taught social studies, you know, and this is a legacy of the colonial system, I believe, is we were never really taught history. We actually don't learn it as a subject. It has to be an optional thing. So even geography, really, you know about rivers. We knew about every river in America growing up. We know about the Mississippi. We know how to spell the Mississippi. We know about we know about the Thames. We knew about all these things growing up, but we didn't know the River Niger sailed from the River Niger flowed from all the way near Sierra Leone, Guinea, all the way to the border between Delta and Anambra states, which are two states which during the Biafra War were the boundary of Igbo land, even though they're the same people. So it's probably a lot. There's probably a lot more to say on this topic, but it's just very interesting, the topic of travel as an African. You know, there's a colonial mindset towards travel, and then there's a different type of travel when, I suppose, you're forced to question yourself. There's a type of travel that you do, and I don't really know if I'm even making sense. I may be just thinking out loud, but it's just so interesting when you brought that up. It just made my mind go elsewhere. But I even forgot your question.
No, you're actually on it. This is the nature of thinking out loud, right? And this is a process of us making sense of the world, our relationship to the world, but also making sense and looking at a world and trying to create a world beyond the conditions that are making this world up. You know, I think that is important, and this is absolutely, you're right on track. You're right on to that. You know, which also guides. So that's a very important philosophy of life, right? You're looking at this world through this multi-complex yet very connected lens, and you're trying to, you know, I don't even like to use the word trying. You are doing a very good job in making sure that there's other people, if there are other people who may be thinking similarly, but also simultaneously, but also able to take what you are producing and think beyond. So the idea here is when you're thinking about this travel, and I wanted to kind of, I guess we can, you know, just kind of riff off of this a little bit, is that, you know, the context of traveling in an African indigenous knowledge system is beyond the physical. It is spiritual, you know, at the same time. And this is what's happening. So what you just explained is exactly where we all are at different levels and different degrees based upon the conditions within which we have found ourselves generation after generation. But yet there still is this absolutely central kernel that, you know, there's something beyond that. There's a story that needs to be told to help us think, and use as a platform to think beyond these particular conditions, right? And so for me, that's, you know, again, for me, that's what I just heard. You know what I mean? And you're materializing what you just said in these films. You're using film as an archive, as a record. You know, like I said, you know, the memory keeper, because even though there's creativity, there's the, you know, the use of different tools, of course. What we're doing right now is sitting down old school underneath the tree and having a conversation about things seen and unseen.
With a mango in our hands.
Right. So let's transition a little bit, because again, we want to move into, you know, obviously a little bit with the documentary on Kemet. But before we get there, this travel, how moving into, the films, and you're looking at, the idea of migration.
Yes.
Right. You're looking at that. Talk a little bit more about the context, but also, how does that fit into this conversation as we're transitioning?
Oh, so this film is called Tafia, which in the Hausa language means traveling or journey. And you see, if we go from the end of the Ọnuọra documentary, for instance, where you're looking at people so desperate for a country that works and want a leader to help facilitate a country that works. If the leader doesn't come, it forces the migration. It forces people to look at options beyond their borders. Very rarely can they find the options they require for the lifestyle that they would like to have across the border. It's quite far away in what is called what they call developed countries, and because of the export of media, television, entertainment, where they see these homes and they see how kids are in high school, there is an aspiration to want to go and have that sort of lifestyle. It's significantly easier than their own. So Tafia, the film, is an exploration of people who have seen the options around them and don't have the means to be able to go legitimately, and feel as my life is worth nothing unless I try and go abroad and make something of it. And to the extent where they will ignore the geological difficulties, they will ignore the potential for violence towards their person by other individuals, the denigration of themselves as Black people to the point where they can arrive in Libya and see themselves being treated as slaves and not feel it is a necessary requirement in order to achieve the dream. Now, the genesis of this project is very important. I drove from, when I was making the documentary on Mali, I drove from Bamako to Timbuktu. Now, the journey from Bamako to Timbuktu stops in Djenné, ancient city, amazing place. Then we go to a place called Mopti. Now, up until about 2 years before that, this was a tourist kind of area, and so was Timbuktu. But with the jihadi violence, this became something where it's a no-go area. So I had to travel in these same trucks that go through the Sahara Desert. And we went on landscapes where there is no road, and essentially the driver is navigating, not using the stars, but using the sky and maybe some minor landmarks. And I traveled as the sole Nigerian in a truck full of Malians. And and getting there was just such a unique experience. We get to Timbuktu, and Timbuktu is filled with all this melange of ethnicities, cultures, and so on, right? And very different to what's painted of it on TV. And so as I'm going back, I'm on a journey back to Bamako with a young boy from Guinea who had just come from Libya, 20 years old. As I'm getting into the truck, there are people saying, oh, do you want to go to Libya? Do you want to go to Libya? So that piqued my interest. And this young boy on the journey back, I spoke to him. I said, look, and he just seemed to have this, he didn't care about the risks to his life, about going there. He didn't care. He had this kind of get rich or die trying mentality, that sort of mentality. And I remember giving him my email and saying, if you ever make it to Europe, contact me. God knows what happened to that boy, but that piqued my interest. Now, of course, that these same routes that they used to go through to Libya were the same routes that, if you follow the same documentary I made on Mali, we document some of these ancient routes that would transport salt and gold and eventually human beings. Same exact routes, utilizing the wells and so on. Obviously now they're more politicized because of the nations that they're in. But it's so interesting that these same routes are being used. So that piqued my interest. And I thought, obviously, in a country, being from a country like Nigeria, bringing it back to the Ọnuọra thing, in a country like Nigeria, where there's so much lack, the desire for individuals to go and try and pursue that, or to try and reach Europe, becomes so much more intense. And so from a traveling point of view, instead of looking at what they could possibly gain from going across the border, they feel, no, let's go all the way to the eye of the storm, right into Babylon. So that's where that story came in. It's an exploration of that. And I focus on a woman who forgoes everything, realizes even, and I won't spoil the film for anybody, it's a 19-minute film, but this is a woman who eventually realizes that, look, if you go to Libya, you could be used as a prostitute. And that doesn't necessarily deter her. So it's just an interesting way of looking at the desperation of African people to reach Europe. And that's a different travel to what you and I were talking about. So it goes back to what we were just saying. There's the conscious way of looking at travel and the unconscious way of looking at travel. And many of these people are ultimately the Walking Dead kind of consciousness,
No, I mean, and so what we're actually getting to, because as you were talking, I was just making sure that I write down a couple of thoughts, because, these themes of migration, these themes of studying, looking at movements, looking at ancient history, all of these things, there's still a response here, right? To, there's a reaction and a response to colonialism and the intentionality of literally, colonizing one's mentality, imagination, and recognition of the realities and the deep traditions within which they're there, that produced, people in these particular communities, to look at something that is actually antagonistic to their very way of being, to their human life, right? That is a deep colonizing or colonization that's happening. So when we think about colonization, what you're doing is like decolonizing decolonization, this process of looking at that, right? So there, because there's a reaction and a response happening all at once, right? The reaction, of course, to the idea that they want a country that works, but they're trying to go to a country that actually created the conditions within which, right? Respond, you can respond, to any of that.
It's I mean, you hit the nail on the head. For one, it's backward thinking, but also it also speaks to the lack of culture in education the lack of culture in education, or education in culture. I'm not sure which way I mean, but there's a sense of, you see, on the one hand, they are unaware that they're going through these routes that are, for centuries were used to transport various things, and which are, seen as the highway of culture. Islam came down that same route into West Africa, and resources went north. And these are things which, especially when you juxtapose it with a kind of a basic European education, Western European education, where they are aware of certain achievements that they have. The average person in that same age group and demographic would be able to make these comparisons and say, oh, we're using these routes and so on, Whereas for us, regardless of whether we are aware of it or not, the system of colonialism has oppressed us so much that it is completely irrelevant even to our daily lives. Whereas if you look at it from another point of view, which is the old parable or proverb about history, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. It's backwards thinking, and I think the griots of Senegal and Mali and these cultural custodians, these people not existing anymore, has led to this In fact, the migration of individuals from the village to the city, this urbanization of Africa, because Kinshasa is Africa, but it's an urbanized Africa. Lagos is Africa, but it's an urbanized Africa. In other words, it's more of a European-centered mindset than the village. If you, I always talk about this. You go to the village and you see the elder people. When I was much younger, those elder people resented the things that were westernized, whereas now, because of also in a way the way media has been pushed towards us, they now want you to bring back everything that you have in England. If you look at it very closely, it can seem like a hopeless situation. It can seem like a hopeless situation. Like, where do we find how do we, not to say that we will ever go back to the way we used to be, but how do we return to an African-centered way of looking at things? In other words, common sense. How do we return to that?
Which this conversation is like just flowing perfectly, which leads right into your documentary on Kemet, right? Let me just make one observation or statement or tease this out for listeners. And to show the most traded thing in human history were ideas and knowledge. And you literally, when you're talking about these roads and the trading of these particular goods, not only was that being, materiality, but the idea that the fundamental structures of all systems of knowledge come through these particular spaces. So imagine one being conscious, traveling these spaces and seeking out that particular rhythm of vibrations, real and I say material and non-material vibrations of that knowledge, to say, I'm going to return, as I'm gonna call Cabral would say, return to the source. And look at the fact that there is systems of knowing that are there at your fingertips, that have produced the very products of the materiality that they want you to bring back from England, but also that actually runs the devices that they're digesting media on, right? So, I mean, I just wanted to say, by all means, if your response or, because this return to the source, this is another bridge to, as we move into, your next documentary, but by all means, I mean, your response would be, welcome.
I'll leave it there. Actually, I'll leave it because I couldn't, it's so, it's so difficult to look at life with these eyes sometimes and be around family even. I mean, a lot of us still have a Judeo-Christian extended family, Pentecostal or whatever. And just to give you just a quick story. I mean, I remember when I was marrying my wife, who's also an Igbo woman, here in the UK, it was more important to observe the culture for cultural purposes, not because the values were overrode or superseded the religion, in a sense, that they've now adopted. In other words, we can break the kola, we can do all of those things for the sake of doing them, but ultimately all that matters is your religion. Are you Christian? And so you start asking yourself the question that, so what is the point of the culture? What is the point? It's really irrelevant if all we're going to do is do it just to tick boxes, and I bring that up just because it goes into the thinking of even language. I teach my children, and my children are learning our language as well as many other languages from Africa, wherever we can find the opportunity. but speaking the language and even understanding why this word is this word. In my language, for example, they say, so there are many ways to say good morning, but one of the ones that they say in my own dialect is Ibolachi, which means you've spread the day. Not good morning, but you've spread the day. But a colonialist mindset associates that with good morning. And that's enough for a Judeo-Christian Igbo person. That's enough, it's good morning. They know the literal translation, but there's no even desire to go deeper and understand why it's about spreading the day. You know, and I think that is even much more of a much more microscopic view of the media that they're consuming. Let's just look at what you already have and how much do you take the time to even explore that before going into what has been brought to you. And that is, I will leave it there because I think we can go on about this just for another few hours because it's so. It influences us in so many different ways, but it always comes down to the same reason. There has been some sort of lack created and the void has been filled by outsiders. And until we recognize, and this is what Dr. Obadile Kambon of the University of Ghana always says, he says, the literal way he says it is, we all have an imaginary white person inside of us. And so it is the aim or objective of every African person to re-Africanize themselves with the letter K, re-Africanize themselves to the point where they fully recognize that they need to get rid of this imaginary white person. And it is only up to them to get rid of it. No one else will do it for them, you know? And again, the Cabral statement of we must act as though we answer to and only answer to our ancestors, children, and the unborn. For one who has finally re-Africanized, rather than look around your peers, focus on the unborn, focus on whether your work is pleasing to the ancestors. In all the work that I do, I think that this is the only deliberate thing that I've done because all I'm doing is learning in the work that I'm doing. But the only thing I've consciously done is taking a stance to say, if my ancestors are seeing this, do I believe that they will be pleased in what I'm saying? And so even if something I say or do is part of history that may have been proven to be so, let me juxtapose it with the other side and how that fits in the context of others and how they do things. You know, because it's one thing to look at how we do things and isolate that and not put it in comparison to the rest of the world. Ukraine can be having an issue right now with their long-term brother that has gone on for 300 or 400 years, a beef between brothers and sisters. But as soon as you decide to put the lens of the Western European and the American and says, this is bully tactics, then it looks very different to what history and reality actually says. And I think with Africans, we are so quick to put the bully on it, you know, without necessarily recognize that we are being bullied into thinking that way.
You just literally gave a deep dissertation on the deep structure of culture, because culture has a deep structure. There's a difference between the artifacts, the language, the culture, but the deep structure of culture, what you're talking about, the implementation or the extraction of the morals and the values and the systems that one's ancestral and historical memory and rituals and practices that form who they are as a collective, not necessarily individuals. So, you know, what Dr. Kambon, of who I want to get to because of what I know of his work as well, that little person is really implementation of a Western philosophical way of life that comes out of a systematic process of the Enlightenment period, right? There was a process to literally, as the French said, they wanted to make, the African more French than the French person, right? That colonialist process, and to see that reproducing itself in the 21st century, as you say, with these odds, there's a constant balance between the anger that one feels, but also the compassion and the drive to reconfigure this world or our societies. So no, we should stop there because we go. But it's a perfect segue into, that brings you to the commission to do the documentary on could you talk a little bit more, as much as you can, about that, and of course, when it's coming out, or anything that you want to share. But I think that this leads us to a great point, a capstone, or I say we put a pin in it, because of course we're going to talk again, but we could put a pin in it, but I think this commission, this is another I would say the dissertation on the work that you're doing, right, as you move into other work, right? So this, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that and make those, I think we're making the connections, but I think that you obviously doing the work and your vision of it and the reason why, those type of things will help our listeners understand.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Kemet that's very, very important is its proximity to Europe. And I think because of its proximity to Europe, it's one of those places which has been allowed for so long to be viewed from a European lens. And I think, the aesthetic is very important. If you see my documentaries, it's a very difficult thing for me to put myself in it, voice over it, and put it all together, do the research, and so on. The aesthetic is crucial. You see, with this Kemet documentary, it's going to be the first documentary for a start that it's not just me, it's myself and Dr. Kambon, who comes from is a second generation, Kamal Kambon is his father, whose contemporaries, I'm sure you're aware of who they are, is a second generation, I suppose, thinker, African thinker. This is somebody who has his family, in order to escape the traditional African-American system of life, took themselves to, I believe, South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, built their own home from scratch, tried to live as though they were, quote unquote, primitive African people in that sense. The son eventually decides to relocate himself. I mean, after going to Morehouse, goes to, this is Dr. Campbell, moves to Ghana, learns numerous African languages, becomes installed in a particular community in Ghana, is so, in a way, reacting to the circumstances that he's going through in America, vis-a-vis the oppression of Black people and the numerous things that we encounter over in America. So he's reacting. And then you have me, someone who was, I suppose, a second generation middle class in the post-colonial era of Africa, West Africa. Who has been exposed to different countries around Europe. I mean, I went to school in Switzerland, I went to boarding schools across West Africa. And I'm coming and I'm almost rebelling against that system that put me there. In a way, not rebelling, but I'm seeing that my father and my mother and their desire to give me the best of Europe. And myself and Dr. Kambon are coming together, and with his knowledge of Medu Necha, with his ability, he's Institute of African Studies, he's a linguist, So bringing together the works of Theophilo Benga, this bringing of languages and saying what are the linguistic connections that we have in Africa, along with my, I suppose, experience as a filmmaker and putting projects together. I think aesthetically, seeing two of us walking through Giza, going through Saqqara, going through Luxor, from a cinematic point of view, cinema alone, and if you understand the power of images, seeing two African men walking through this land that their ancestors walked through, to the point of to the extent that we would almost blend in. In fact, Dr. Kambon's clothing, he's made clothes like if you remember, I forget which temple, but Amenhotep the second. Excuse me, no, Akhenaten, the clothes that he wore down to the sandals, he's so he's bought into the culture so much that if he and I walking through that land would be something which, if you placed us there 7,000 years ago, we would fit in. I think for young people, young African people, especially when you put that alongside the average documentary about Egypt, seeing two African men that look like that, walking through this land, we may be talking absolute rubbish, but the impact culturally, when I stand next to the Sphinx, when Dr. Kambon reads the words that are written on the walls of the Ramesseum, and hear what these people are actually saying about their Africanness, I think, my brother, this has the potential to awaken many more of our children. Forget about the grown-ups, our children. And sometimes, especially as a filmmaker, and that's why I feel like the dramatist is more important than the documentarian, being able to tell a story with your images, as opposed to what you're actually saying. And I think that is where the drama of it all. And I really want to keep this a surprise, but we have some. We're doing some very interesting things. It's not a run-of-the-mill talking heads documentary where we're just going. We say, oh, this says this and this says that. We are living as people from Kemet, and I honestly cannot wait. We were going to shoot in June last year, and then there was the pandemic came back. So it's been a long time coming. And I cannot wait for you to see it. I cannot wait, because I also look at the obstacles. When I went to do the documentary in Mali, Africa in general is a very bureaucratic place. Again, part of this legacy of colonialism. But Egypt is incredibly bureaucratic, and they're very precious about the images of Egypt that are shown. So they almost everywhere that we go, we have to get permits and so on. So instead, we've chosen to approach this documentary from a different point of view. How do we live as if we were traveling our homeland? And I think when the images come out, they have the potential to inspire, but also it's education without information. It's education with images. You make the link yourself. You go do the further research. One last thing I just want to bring up. When I was growing up, there was a film called Khartoum. It's a film starring Laurence Olivier and Charlton Heston. It's about the famous Mahdi Sudanese British War, Anglo-Sudanese War of the late 1800s. Now, for one, the Mahdi, who's a Black African jihadi, I suppose you would call him, is played by a white man in blackface. And by the end of the film, it becomes a war against the Christian God and the, I suppose, African/Arab Muslim God. And the Muslim God is defeated by the Christian God, even though the Christian God's example, this man called Charles Gordon, an English general who was sent to govern Khartoum, which is Sudan, he dies. It's a famous story. But again, growing up, I was so obsessed with that film because it was well told and so on. But at the end of it, it was about the decline of my people. It wasn't until I grew older that I looked at that film and the images of that film and said to myself, this man defeated the English. He killed their general. He conquered Khartoum, and Khartoum has stayed part of Sudan for the last 100 and so years. Obviously now Sudan is split into two, but he did the work. But I looked at it through a colonial mindset. And I think it's this film that we're about to make about Kemet is almost like my way of, if I was the filmmaker making a film for me as a child, it would be this sort of film where I don't need to bog you down with who's God. We're not talking about God. We're talking about the image that you see. And let's look at the image as something that is beautiful, that is strong, that is powerful. And I think that in 2022, in an Instagram culture, in a 150 character culture, where information is all about highlights, I think an image truly will tell a powerful story. And I think that's what we're aiming for with this next documentary.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, because I don't want to ask any more questions. I'll say them all for when we talk again. Much success. I am looking forward. Hopefully, I'm not going to say hopefully, I'm sure, our listeners and folk that, our networks are going to, be more engaged in the work that you're doing. And of course, with the setup that you've just given us for this particular iteration of your work, I'm sure, because there's a growing, for all intents and purposes of the negatives and the death and things that 2020 has brought in these years, it also created a platform, a way where people had to sit down and start to question realities. And there's a growing, communities of people. There are a number of, there's been growing podcasts and growing, YouTube and growing, there's a growing hunger that Africa is awakening, so to speak. And the only thing that I feel, one of the things that I feel that as our job, as whether we're doing multimedia, film, is to make sure that those structures of connection, those structures of sustainable communication and exchange across the African world are set. And so, I appreciate the work. Like I told you before, I tell this to the public, this is just as much as your platform as it is everybody else's. Again, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
My brother, I appreciate you. Thank you. Continue the work. As long as I have something to say, I will contact you and we will say it together. So I appreciate you. I appreciate the platform. And I think it's very important that platforms like this continue to run. I think especially in the world that we live in now, where this form of entertainment and information is really for a select few. Sorry to go into a little bit more, but ignorance is almost championed over intelligence now, and it's platforms like this as an African that if you lend your ears for a few minutes, it can transform your life. And I must say that when I first started listening to your platform, it was one of those things that coincided with my eyes opening. And it felt like the place that I could go to and find people like me who had a desire to educate, but not necessarily be in a classroom, but felt that education is beyond the classroom. And I thank you guys for all your work, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for those words, and we did not pay you to say that. So. No, seriously, thank you. And like I said, we will be in touch.
Okay.
Child looking at the moon, just looks like the sun, but these are to stay true.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Orderson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.